Good day, BSMLS 1 students. Welcome to San Pedro College. Welcome to the Bachelor of Science in Medical Laboratory Science Department. This will be our first lecture for Anatomy and Physiology. I am Dr. Let's have a review of the organization of the human body as discussed in the part 1 of the Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. You have learned that the smallest structural and functional unit of the human body is the cell. If this cell is grouped with other cells, they will be able to form what we call a tissue. If tissues are grouped together, they will form an organ. And an organ, if grouped with other organ with related functions, they will be able to form a body system. These are the four basic types of tissue. We have the connective, epithelial, muscle, and nervous tissue. If these four are combined together, they will be able to form an organ. This is the esophagus. Esophagus is one of the organs that belong to the digestive system. Since it is an organ, you should expect that it should be composed of group of tissues. This is the cross-section of the esophagus, but I want everybody to take note. This one is currently infected. So I want you to assume that we are processing a normal and healthy esophagus. So we will prepare a thin section of the esophagus, put it on a slide and apply stain. And this is how it will look like under the microscope. The esophagus is an organ and it's supposed to be composed of tissue. This is its epithelium. This is its connective tissue. And this is its muscle tissue. At this point, we will look into the epithelium of the esophagus, and this is how it will look like under oil immersion objective. Can you appreciate that the epithelium is composed of group of cells? So therefore, tissues are made up of group of cells. And the esophagus, being an organ, has one of the tissues, and that is the epithelium. Let's proceed. Let's try to view the connective tissue of the esophagus under oil immersion objective. And this is how it will look like. Can you appreciate that on this particular tissue, you have the group of cells, you have the fibers, and you have the ground substances? So therefore, the esophagus, being an organ, is composed of tissues. And what we have highlighted so far are the epithelium and connective tissues. Let's try to take a look at the muscle tissue of the esophagus under oil immersion objective, and this is how it will look like. Please appreciate that the muscle tissue is composed of group of muscle cells or muscle fibers. So what have we proven so far? That tissues are made up of group of cells, and if these tissues are grouped together, they will be able to form an organ. The esophagus is an organ, and it is formed by the union of epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle, and nervous tissues. In the quizzes and exams, you will be asked to identify the different regions of our body and as well as the locations of the different organs of our body. That's why you, learners, should memorize what we call standard position of reference, and that is what we call as the anatomical position. In anatomical position, the person should be standing erect, facing the observer, and that is you, with head level. Eyes should be directed forward. Feet flat on the floor and should be directed forwards. Upper limbs should be on the sides and not on the back, with palms directed forward. So for you to easily memorize the correct anatomical position, I want you to copy whatever is the guy doing in the picture. You should stand erect, maintain head level, eyes should be directed forward, feet should be flat on the floor and should be directed forwards, and then your upper limb should be on your sides with palms directed forward. If you will memorize now the correct anatomical position, you will now be able to identify the relationship of the locations of the different organs in our body, and we will have sample applications later on. If the body is in a reclining position, we can use the following terms. Prone if the body is facing down. Supine if the body is facing up. This patient is in a prone position. while this patient is in a supine position. Let's now go with the different regions of our body. Let's start with the most superior one, and that is the head. The head has two portions. Number one, the bony structure that encloses and protects the brain, that is the skull. And then the anterior portion or the front portion of the head, which is the face. And that is where we have our eyes, nose, mouth, cheeks, and chin. The next region of our body is the neck, and the neck functions to support the head and connects and or attaches the head to the trunk, which is another region of our body. The neck functions to attach the head to the trunk, which is another region in our body. The trunk is further divided into three portions. We have the chest, where we can find our heart and lungs. We have the abdomen, where we can find the stomach, the small and the large intestine. And then the lowermost portion of the trunk, which is the pelvis, where we can find the male and female internal genitalia. Another region of the body is the upper limb, and the upper limb is further divided into proximal portion and distal portion. The proximal portion of the upper limb would start from the shoulder down to the elbow, and the distal portion of the upper limb starts from the elbow down to the hand. Let's try to review first the first four regions of our body. We have the head, which is composed of the skull and the face. We have the neck. We have the trunk, which is further divided into chest, abdomen, and pelvis. We have the upper limb, which has two portions, the proximal from shoulder to elbow, the distal from elbow to the wrist, and then the hand. The last region of the body is the lower limb. The lower limb includes the following. Number one, the buttocks, the area highlighted in green color. The next portion of the lower limb is the thigh, and the thigh starts from the buttocks down to the knee. The next portion of the lower limb is the leg, and the leg starts from the knee down to the ankle. And then the last two portions of the lower limbs, the ankle and the foot. This is Ian Salaver, and I will be talking about introduction. Before we'll proceed with the next topic, I want you to fill in the blanks. The first person to give me the correct answers will win 1,000 pesos. Please send your answer directly to my Telegram account or Facebook Messenger. Before we'll proceed with our next topic, please be reminded of the correct anatomical position, because this will serve as your reference position in determining the positions of the organs in our body. So let's try to define some terms. If the organ is above another organ, then you would refer to it or describe it as superior, cephalic, or cranial. If the organ is found below another organ, then the appropriate description or term that would refer to that organ is inferior or caudal. So let's apply what you have learned from this particular PPT slide. I want you to take a look at the liver and the gallbladder. The liver is found above the gallbladder, so you can always say that the liver is superior to the gallbladder because the liver is above the gallbladder and it is closer to the head. The gallbladder, on the other hand, is inferior to the liver because it is below the liver and it is located away or farther from the head. By the way, the terms cephalic and cranial are referring to the head or the skull. So therefore, if the organ is superior to another organ, then that organ is nearer to the head or skull. The term caudal means tail. So meaning the organ is inferior to another organ and it is nearer to the tail. The next two terms that you need to memorize, anterior and posterior. Anterior can also be referred to as ventral. If the organ is found in front of another organ, then that organ is said to be ventrally located. If the organ is found at the back of another organ, then you would refer to that organ as posteriorly located. The other term for posterior, by the way, is dorsal. So, let's apply what you have learned from this particular PPT slide. I want you to take a look at this picture. Look for the trachea and the esophagus. Can you appreciate that the trachea is found in front of the esophagus? So, therefore, the trachea is anterior to the esophagus, while the esophagus is posterior to the trachea. Next, we have medial and lateral. If the organ is found near the center or midline of the body, then you would describe it to be medially located. If the organ is found away from the center or midline of the body, then you would use the term lateral. So let's try to apply this one on a picture of tibia and fibula. So these are the bones of our leg. Why am I so sure that this is the leg? Because it starts from the knee down to the ankle. So take a look at the location of the tibia and fibula, and I want you to imagine the correct anatomical position. Which among these bones do you think is nearer to the center or midline of the body? That is the tibia. So therefore, the tibia is medially located to the fibula, while the fibula is lateral to the tibia. If both of the organs are found on the same side of the body, then you would describe them to be ipsilateral. If the organs are found on opposite sides of the body, then you would describe them to be contralateral. So I want you to look for the gallbladder in the picture and the appendix. Since they are both found on the right side of the body, therefore you can say that the gallbladder and the appendix are ipsilateral to each other. Take a look at the appendix and the spleen. Since they are found on opposite sides of the body, then you would describe the spleen and the appendix as contralateral to each other. The next terms are proximal and distal. These terms are used to describe the organ in relation to its point of origin and attachment. That's why these terms are frequently used to describe organs and structures in our upper limbs and lower limbs. But please take note that these terms can also be used to describe other organs in our body. Now, if the structure is found close to its point of attachment, then you would use the term proximal. If it is found away from the point of attachment, then you would use the term distal. So let's try to apply that on sample pictures. I want you to take a look at the picture of the hand and the elbow. Remember, the upper limb is attached to the shoulder. So which among these two structures are found nearer to, which among them is found nearer to the shoulder? It's the elbow. So you would use the term proximal to describe the elbow, and you would use the term distal to describe the hand. Let's have another example. Let's compare the wrist and the hand. In relation to the point of attachment, that could be the elbow or the shoulder, which do you think should be best described with the term proximal? That should be the wrist, right? And the hand should be described with the term distal. The last but not the least, the terms superficial and deep. If the structure is near the surface of the body, then it is described to be superficial. If it is found away from the body, then you would use the term deep. So let's try to have a sample quiz. Take a look at the picture of the brain and the heart. So, based on the location, the brain is blank to the heart. Yes, superior. That's why in loving someone, you should always use your brain more often than your heart because it is superior to the heart. I'm just joking. Nagugutra ko. Next, we have the liver and the lungs. So, based on the location, the liver is blank to the lungs. What do you think is the answer? Inferiorly located. Very good. Or inferior. Next, take a look at the picture of the sternum and how is it related to the heart? Yes, the sternum is anterior to the heart because it is located in front of the heart. Next, we have pictures of trachea and esophagus. The esophagus is blank to the trachea. What do you think is the correct term that you should use or fill into that blank space there? Posterior. Very good, because it is found behind the trachea. Lastly, we have the bones radius and ulna. These are the bones found on our forearm. The bone highlighted in red color is the radius. So based on the location, the ulna is blank to the radius. The correct answer is medial, while the radius is lateral to the ulna. Very good. Let's talk about planes. Planes are imaginary flat surfaces or lines that would pass through the body or some of its organs. There are several types of planes. The first one are the sagittal planes. Sagittal planes are vertical planes, so they are plotted like that of y-axis. And these vertical planes would divide the body into right and left. Now, there are two types of sagittal planes. If the sagittal plane will divide the body into two equal parts, right and left, then you would refer to it as mid-sagittal plane. But if the plane will divide the body away from the midline into unequal right and left, then you would refer to that sagittal plane as parasagittal. Again, sagittal planes are vertical planes that would divide the body into right and left. The other types of planes are frontal, transverse, and oblique. If the plane will divide the body into front and back or ventral, dorsal, or anterior, posterior, you would refer to that plane as frontal or coronal plane. If the plane will divide the body into superior and inferior, you would refer to the plane as transverse plane. Let's review. If the plane will divide the body into right and left, you will call it as sagittal plane. If the plane will divide the body into front and back, you would call it as frontal or coronal plane. If the plane will divide the body into superior and inferior, you would refer to it as transverse plane. The last type of plane is oblique plane. What do you notice about sagittal, frontal, and transverse plane? They would pass through the body at a 90-degree angle. Oblique plane, on the other hand, passes through the body or any organ of the body at an angle other than 90 degrees. And this is an example of an oblique plane. So let's try to identify the following planes. Let's start with the red rectangle. That plane divides the body into right and left. So therefore, that is the, very good, sagittal plane. Let's take a look at the yellow rectangle. As you can see, the plane divides the body into superior and inferior. So what is that? Transverse plane. By the way, I forgot to mention, transverse plane is also known as horizontal plane. Let's go with the green rectangle. As you can see, that plane is dividing the body into front and back, anterior and posterior. So the green rectangle is what plane? Very good. Coronal or frontal plane. In the laboratory, especially in performing biopsy and autopsy procedures, the pathologist will cut organs following the different planes that we have discussed a while ago. So take a look at the animated picture on the PPT slide. Can you appreciate that that person is cutting the brain following the transverse plane? So those pieces of brain that are coming out from the machine will now be referred to as sections. And since they are made by cutting the brain through the transverse plane, you will now call them as transverse sections. Sections now are cut portions of the body or any organ of the body that are made along the directions of the plane. So if the organ is cut through the transverse plane, then the portions that will be produced will be referred to as transverse sections. Then you also have frontal or coronal sections, and you have sagittal sections. So the sections will be named depending on how the cut was made, depending on what plane was followed. So I want you to take a look at the picture of the brain. If the brain will be cut in this manner, we are cutting through what plane? transverse plane or horizontal plane. So therefore, the cut portion of the brain will be called as the transverse or horizontal section. So take a look at this one. How do you think the brain is cut in this picture? Along what plane? Coronal or frontal. So that's why this section will be called as the coronal or frontal section of the brain. How do you think the brain is cut in this picture? It is cut through what plane? Sagittal. So therefore, this one is the sagittal section of the brain. So let's have a sample quiz. How do you think this cadaver was cut? Yes, through sagittal plane. So therefore, this is the blank section of the cadaver. Sagittal section. Very good. How about this one? Yeah, this was prepared through cutting the body via the transverse or horizontal plane. So therefore, this is the transverse section of the human body. How about these sections here? What will you call them? Frontal or coronal sections. Very good. Let's discuss body cavities. So what are body cavities? These are spaces in our body that house organs and provide protection. So let's discuss the first two types of cavities. You have letter A, the cranial cavity, the one that encloses the brain and protects it from trauma and damage. Then you have the long vertical or spinal cavity that houses or contains the spinal cord. Now, what makes these two cavities unique is that they are continuous with each other because the spinal cord is attached to the brain. That's why the cranial cavity should be continuous with the spinal or vertebral cavity. And aside from being enclosed by bones, skull for the brain, vertebral bones for the spinal cord, you also have additional protective layers or structures to the brain and the spinal cord. You have the meninges and the cerebrospinal fluid. So, in the case of cranial and vertebral spinal cavities, aside from the bones, you also have the meninges and CSF, which can provide additional protection to the brain and spinal cord. Why is it that it's not enough that the brain should be covered by bone itself? Why do you think we should have meninges and CSF inside the cranial cavity or spinal or vertebral cavity? I want you to take a look at the animated photo in the PPT slide. I want you to imagine if you will suddenly have what we call whiplash injury, if the brain is directly enclosed by the skull and you don't have the CSF and the meninges there, every time a person would have that whiplash injury, the brain will directly hit the bone, the skull, and the brain will sustain massive or extensive damage. And to prevent the massive and the extensive damage to occur, you should also cover the brain with meninges and CSF. In this cadaver, the skull was already removed, exposing the brain. Can you appreciate that there's a protective sheath covering the brain that is now part of the meninges, and they can provide additional protection. So take a look at this picture. You have here the skull, which is protecting the brain, and below the skull, you have there the brain. But in the space between the skull and the brain, you have their protective sheath, which we will refer to as the meninges. And then, between the layers of the meninges, you also have a fluid that can provide cushion. Cushion. And that is the cerebrospinal fluid. So take note, in both cranial, vertebral, and spinal cavities, aside from the bones, you also have meninges and cerebrospinal fluid, which also provide additional protection to the brain and spinal cord. The third cavity in the brain is labeled as letter C in the picture, and that's the thoracic cavity. And that is also referred to as the chest cavity because it is found basically on our chest area. Now, take note. This thoracic cavity is surrounded by the following. You have the ribs, the muscle of the chest, the sternum, and the thoracic portion of the vertebral column. I will highlight all of these structures in the succeeding slide. So you have to memorize them. The thoracic cavity or chest cavity surrounded by what again? You have ribs, muscles of the chest, you have sternum, then you have the thoracic portion of the vertebral column. I want you to take note that the thoracic cavity is composed of three smaller cavities. We have the pericardial, which houses the heart. You have the pleural cavity, which houses the lungs. Then you have the mediastinum. And we will discuss them on the succeeding slides. Again, the thoracic or chest cavity is surrounded by the muscles of the chest. You have the sternum, you have the ribs, and the thoracic portion of the vertebral column. The thoracic cavity is further divided into three smaller cavities. You have the pericardial cavity, which houses the heart. You have the pleural cavity, which houses the lungs. And the area between these two cavities is the mediastinum. And that is found at the central portion of the chest or thoracic cavity. Not shown in the photo is the pleural cavity because it is found on the lateral side of the body. What we have here is the pericardial cavity, and between the pericardial and the pleural cavity, you have the mediastinum, the area that is colored with yellow-green in the picture. Now, I want everybody to take note that the mediastinum extends from the sternum to the vertebral column, and it also ranges from the first rib down to the diaphragm. So the next question now is, what are the organs we can find in the mediastinum? Take note, in the pericardial cavity, you have the heart. In the pleural cavity, you have the lungs. So what are the organs now that are found within the mediastinum, the third cavity within the chest or thoracic cavity? There are a lot of structures that can be found within the mediastinum, and we'll just highlight few of them. I want you to take note that the portion labeled as letter D in the picture is the diaphragm. It's not a cavity, but it's very important for you to remember that the diaphragm is the structure responsible for separating the chest or thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. By the way, diaphragm is a skeletal muscle and it is one of our respiratory muscles. Now, below the diaphragm, you have there the abdominal cavity. That is where we can find our stomach, small intestine, some portions of the large intestine. I have to emphasize that only some portions of the large intestine. Why? Because the other portions of large intestine can be found on another cavity, and that's the pelvic cavity. We can also find in the abdominal cavity our gallbladder, liver, and spleen. So take a look at the picture of the abdominal cavity. You have there the stomach, the liver, gallbladder, small intestine, and add some portions of the large intestine. The last but not the least among all the cavities in the body is the pelvic cavity, and it is the cavity found below the abdominal cavity. It is in the pelvic cavity where we can find the internal organs of the male and female reproductive tract. That is also we can find some of the portions of the large intestine and then the urinary bladder. Please take note that the organs that you can find in the abdominal cavity and pelvic cavity will be referred to as visceral organs. So the stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, the liver, the gallbladder, the urinary bladder, the male and female internal reproductive organs are all referred to as visceral organs. So in the pelvic cavity of women, that is where we can find the urinary bladder, the internal organs of the female reproductive tract, which includes the uterus, fallopian tube, and ovaries, and then some portions of the large intestine. This is the abdominal cavity. Below it is the pelvic cavity. In men, the pelvic cavity contains number one, urinary bladder, and then the internal organs of the male reproductive system, which include the vas deferens, you have the seminal vesicle, you have the prostate, and as well as some of the portions of the large intestine. Please take note that the organs that belong to the abdomen and pelvic area are referred to as viscera or visceral organs. So let's try to identify the different cavities in our body. So let's start with number one. What is that? Cranial cavity. And that's the one that encloses the brain. Letter B is most likely what? Vertebral or spinal cavity. Let's go with letter A. Letter A is the mediastinum. That is where you can find the trachea, esophagus, thymus, and aorta, right? And then letter C is most likely the pleural cavity, and that is where we can find the lungs. How about letter D? Letter D is pericardial cavity, the one that encloses or houses the heart. Letter E in the picture is diaphragm, and that's the skeletal muscle that separates the thoracic or chest cavity from the abdominal cavity. Number 3 is most likely what cavity? Abdominal cavity. Very good. While number 4 is the pelvic cavity. Please take note that if you are going to refer to both abdomen and pelvis, you can refer to them as abdominopelvic cavity. And the organs that belong to the abdominopelvic cavity will be called viscera or visceral organs. We still have two more cavities in our head, the nasal cavity and the oral cavity. As you can see, they are also spaces which can contain organs or structures. What makes these cavities different from the pericardial, pleural, abdominal, pelvic cavity is that these cavities are exposed to the external environment. Now, let's talk about membranes. Structures that cover cavities are referred to as membranes. And there are cavities that are exposed directly to the exterior portion of the body, and there are cavities that do not directly open to the exterior portion of the body. The membranes covering those cavities that open to the exterior portion of the body will be referred to as mucous membrane. So the membrane covering the nasal and oral cavities are referred to as mucous membrane, while the membranes covering the cavities that do not directly open to the exterior portion of the body are referred to as serous membrane. So expect that the pleural cavity, the pericardial cavity, pelvic, abdominal cavity are all lined by serous membrane. Take note, serous membrane is a double layered membrane, which I will emphasize later on. Take note, serous membrane is the membrane covering of the organs that do not directly open into the exterior portion of the body, while mucous membranes are the membrane covering of the cavities such as nasal cavity and oral cavity that open directly to the exterior portion of the body. As mentioned from the previous slide, the cavities that do not directly open to the exterior portion of the body are covered with serous membranes. Serous membranes are composed of two layers of membranes. So for you to understand what do I mean by serous membrane, having two layers of membrane, I want you to take a look at the fist in the picture. Can you appreciate that the fist is fitted into a balloon? There's that portion of the balloon that will directly cover the fist. And there's also that portion of the balloon that will form the wall. I want you to imagine that because that is how a serous membrane will look like. So take a look at the picture of the heart on the left side of the screen. the heart is enclosed within the pericardial cavity. Can you appreciate that the heart is covered by two layers of membrane? One membrane is directly in contact with the heart, the same as the portion of the balloon that is directly covering the fist. That portion of the membrane is referred to as the visceral membrane. And then you also have a membrane that provides the wall of the cavity, and that membrane will be referred to as parietal membrane. So therefore, serous membranes are composed of two layers of membranes. You have visceral membrane and then you have the parietal membrane. Between the visceral membrane and the parietal membrane, you now have there the pericardial fluid, and that's the cavity. Since the cavity is called pericardial cavity, you will name the visceral membrane as visceral pericardium, and you will name the parietal membrane as parietal pericardium. Let's try to apply that one on this picture. We have here the lungs. The lungs is enclosed within the pleural cavity, and the pleural cavity is covered by serous membrane. So expect to find two layers of membrane. The membrane that comes in contact directly with the lungs, you call that as the visceral membrane. While the membrane that will form the wall of the cavity, you call that as the parietal membrane. The space between the parietal and visceral membrane is now called the pleural cavity, and that is where you can find the fluid. Now, since these membranes are covering the pleural cavity, you will call the visceral membrane as visceral pleura, and you will call the parietal membrane as parietal pleura. Let's try to take a look at this heart from a cadaver. This is the visceral pericardium, the membrane of the pericardial cavity that directly covers the heart. And then this structure is forming the wall of the pericardial cavity. So that is the parietal pericardium. And the space between the visceral and parietal pericardium is called the pericardial cavity. And that is now where you can find the pericardial fluid. This is a dissected cadaver. Take a look at the lungs. Can you appreciate that the lungs is still contained within a cavity? So the outer wall is labeled in the picture as the parietal pleura. So if we'll open or dissect that parietal pleura, we will see the lungs, and we will be looking also into the visceral pleura. So just imagine the picture from the previous slide. So we will try to open up the parietal pleura to expose the lungs. This is now the parietal pleura, and this is now the visceral pleura, the one that directly comes in contact with the lungs. So the space between the parietal and visceral is the pleural cavity. So in serous membranes, we have two layers of membranes. You have the parietal layer, which lines the wall of the cavity. Then you have the visceral layer, the covering that comes in contact directly with the organ or adheres tightly to the organ. So the serous membranes of the pleural cavity is called pleura. That's why the layers will be called parietal and visceral pleura. The serous membrane of the pericardial cavity will be referred to as pericardium. That's why you have the terms parietal and visceral pericardium. While for the abdominal cavity, by the way, abdominal cavity is also called as the peritoneal cavity. We will refer to the serous membrane as peritoneum. That's why the membranes there will be called parietal and visceral peritoneum. That leads us to our last topic, the abdominal regions and quadrants. These regions and quadrants are used to specifically locate the organ that belongs to the abdomen and pelvic cavity. There are two ways on how to come up with the regions or quadrants of the abdomen. The first method is to draw two horizontal and two vertical lines, which will assume a tic-tac-toe grid. And those two horizontal and two vertical lines will divide the abdomen and the pelvis or the abdominopelvic cavity into 9 regions. So what are these 9 regions? We will identify them on the succeeding slide. So the 9 regions created by forming 2 vertical lines and 2 horizontal lines on the abdominopelvic cavity are the following. You have the hypochondriac region, right and left. You have the lumbar region, right and left. Then you have the iliac regions, right and left. So that's a total of 6 regions. The last 3 regions are the following: the epigastric region, the umbilical region, and the hypogastric region. At this point, I want you all to tell me in what region of the abdomen you can particularly find the liver. The answer is right hypochondriac region. Very good. Next, in what region of the abdominopelvic cavity can one find the appendix? Although it's not shown in the picture, but you know where you can locate it. Yeah, it's on the right iliac region. So please memorize the 9 regions of the abdominopelvic cavity. The second method is easier to do than the first method. This time, you're just going to create a mid-sagittal line. So expect a vertical line in the middle. And then create a transumbilical line. And these 2 lines now will divide the abdominopelvic area into 4 quadrants. You have the right upper, left upper, right lower, and left lower quadrants. Using the quadrants of the abdomen, can you please locate the location of the liver? Yeah, right upper quadrant. Can you please locate the location of the, or identify the location of the spleen? Yeah, left upper quadrant. Last, can you please give me the location of the appendix? Right lower quadrant. Very good. And that ends my lecture on Introduction to Anatomy and Physiology. Good luck with our quiz, future RMTs and future MTs. One is the thymus, the organ responsible for the maturation of our T lymphocytes. Don't worry, we will highlight thymus in our lymphatic system. Other organs that can be found in the mediastinum are, you have the trachea, and at the back of the trachea, you have the esophagus. Another thing, we also have in our mediastinum the aorta. But I have to label the picture first. This is the heart, and that is found within the pericardial cavity. And then this is the trachea. Posterior to it, you have the esophagus. And I want you to appreciate that the large blood vessel arising from the heart, which is the aorta, is also found within the mediastinum. Me and physiology.